Our speaker today is Bob Kyte, President of Adventist Risk Management. Bob has served on just a few boards. I think it's somewhere around 20, probably more, and has been speaking on this topic for some time. Before coming to Adventist Risk Management, Bob was General Counsel to the Seventh-day Adventist Church at the General Conference. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Nice to be here today.
Great. Well, let's get started.
Okay, we're looking at the title, I'm on the board. Now what do I do? And let me just add a comment before we get into this, because executive committees of conferences are very much the same as a board of directors. Oh, there's some differences, like who chairs the board at a conference versus the executive committee versus a board. But overall, the requirements for the directors or the trustees or the executive committee member are much the same. You know, it's kind of an interesting comment. One time, one of the governors of the state of Georgia was asked what they could do to improve the prison system in the state of Georgia. His answer was kind of an interesting one. We can't improve the quality of our prisons until we get a better class of inmates. I'm not suggesting today that prisoners and board members are the same, but kind of that principle applies. If you're going to be on the board or on an executive committee, you really need to know what those expectations are so that you can relate well to what your activities should be, as opposed to simply sitting there wondering what you should be doing next.
So say I'm elected to a board or executive committee, what kind of expectations might I be facing?
Well, you know, some of these expectations are pretty obvious, but unfortunately a lot of people don't pay attention to the obvious. For example, attend the board meetings regularly. That's an important aspect of this, and unfortunately sometimes board members only attend when the agenda suits their whims. So you got to get to the meetings regularly. You need to be an active supporting member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. You need to commit a sufficient amount of time to become oriented to the director responsibilities to be an informed participant in the governance decision making. You need to serve as a member on board committees if they have them. You need to review the agenda materials before you go to the board meetings and be well prepared. You know, one of the things that always concerns me in the church is that we have so many meetings. I'm sure that all of you who are attending, and I see a number of people on the attendance list that I know, are probably sitting in so many committees that you don't have time to really prepare. When you're sitting on the board of an institution or the executive committee, there really should be that expectation so that you can do the last item on this particular page, and that's contribute to the board discussions and decision making. There's some other expectations, kind of in a general way. You need to support the board decisions and demonstrate a commitment to teamwork. One of the things I point out is that a board member has no individual power. The board functions as a board, not as a group of individuals. So it's the action of the board that counts. It's not the action of one individual. You need to promote the organization. You need to comply with the conflict of interest policy. We're going to discuss that a little later in more detail. You need to assist the board in evaluating its own performance, and as a trustee, your own involvement. You need to take part in board education. A lot of institutions, a lot of organizations have a lot of complexities and different ways of doing business. You need to be aware of that through the board education process. And you need to participate in institutional support through your own resources. That doesn't necessarily mean financial, but it does mean time and your commitment to the organization, and to also actively support the organization by encouraging others to get involved and to support it.
All right, so I'm elected to the board, I understand the expectations, and now I'm really actively engaged in this organization. How involved do I need to become in the day-to-day details of running the organization?
Well, that's always a bit of a conundrum for directors, and I suppose it's a little bit different in an executive committee versus a board. But let's take a look at a board, say, for an institution, because boards really are responsible for governance. They are to look at the accountability by setting goals and evaluating the performance of the company. They are to set the strategic plans and the major policies, and they're to oversee the implementation of those major items. Management, on the other hand, is involved in implementing plans and policies, managing the day-to-day activities and operations of the organization, and reporting on performance. And too often, and we'll get a little bit more into this, but too often boards start to move from governance into management. And board members want to take an active role in the management of the day-to-day operations. And those really are left to the officers of the organization, whether that's a conference or whether that's an institution. And the board needs to be careful that they don't get into involvement in the day-to-day activities. So those are kind of important things, and it leads us to what good boards do. Because if you're going to be a director, a trustee, or a member of the executive committee, you need to know what boards are supposed to do. And here's 9 points. There's probably more, but there's 9 key points. One is to shape the mission and the strategic direction of the organization. The second, David's kind of in your line.
Well, that's right, and that's maintain the STA trademark identity of the organization. There's great resources about that actually at adventist.org, right on the church's website.
And in maintaining that identity, it is also to maintain it as an Adventist organization. As I said earlier, you need to establish the key policies and strategies. These are not operational policies from the standpoint of how you do things day to day as much as they are from a general standpoint or an oversight standpoint of the board. You need to also select and develop and evaluate officers. In the conference setting, this does not work that way, because normally officers, unless they're between sessions of the conference, are put in place by the session through a nominating committee process. In institutions, church organizations that have institutional hierarchies, so to speak, their officers are put in by the board of directors. The board or the committee needs to also ensure that there's adequate financial resources. You know, I did a seminar here about a month or two ago in another country, and one of the things that they asked about was the fact that they had problems on the campus with finances of the school setting, and that the staff were not being paid regular wages. My point on that is that really was a board issue. The board needs to make sure that there's adequate finances for the organization to continue and to operate. Go ahead. They need to build the reputation of the organization. That's another area you're concerned about, David.
Very much so. I mean, we're talking about brand in this case, and perhaps the church is more familiar with the term reputation, but your ministry cannot move forward without a very strong, positive reputation.
Absolutely. Very important, especially in the Adventist community. And if you're a conference organization, it's important from the standpoint of having credibility, not only with the community, but the laity that you have in your church. Risk management may seem like a funny board function, and it's not just because we're from risk management, but the risk management involves a whole plethora of activities, not just the kind of things like trip and falls on your property. But your risk management also needs to work through its audit committees and various other ways to make sure that the financial processes in the organization are well in place, that there's separation of duties and all of those things that go along with preserving and protecting the resources of the organization. They also need to assess the performance against mission. A lot of times organizations, and this can happen in a variety from institutions to other types of organizations like schools, that maybe have lost their sense of mission, or maybe they're just going from day to day and they don't have much of a strategic direction. The board really needs to step into that kind of organization and take corrective action. And then, of course, they need to improve their own performance, because it's important to boards to make sure that they are functioning well.
So, what about when things go wrong?
Well, there's a number of things, David, that can go wrong in a board. And some of them don't look like they're wrong, but they can be if they're not carefully observed. If all the board does is look into the rearview mirror by looking at old financial statements, even last month's financial statements, and look backwards to see how the organization has performed, they miss a really great opportunity from the standpoint of strategic management that the board should be actively involved with. The other thing that boards often do is they react to circumstances. And that's, understandable, especially if there's a major problem comes up. But boards should move beyond being reactive to the things that come to them and should be proactive in planning what needs to be done and how things need to be done in the future. They should not just spend their time reworking or redoing what staff has already done. Another area of leaking accountability, as we call it, is where board members get personally involved in the matters that should be left to the CEO, the president, the conference treasurer, the institutional CFO, and they want to get involved and really get into the management issues as opposed to the governance issues. And there's also then the uncertainty over boundaries of authority. What should the board do? What should the officers do? And those types of issues come up. Another part of the challenges that face boards or institutions or executive committees is where one or two people take control of the discussion. That may be even the chair or the institution head. Boards need to be open for discussion and full involvement of all the people that sit on them, and not simply come into a meeting and have one or two people that give a few reports, tell them what they're going to do, and call that the end of the meeting. I've seen that happen in some environments where the chair takes control of the meeting, tells the executive committee what's going to happen, and they are expected to fall in line and make it happen. So David, let's move on to really now the crux of the assignment of a director. And this assignment falls on directors or trustees of corporations. It also falls on executive committee members. And really there are three major duties that you as a director should have in an organization. Those are the duties of care, the duties of loyalty, and the duties of obedience. And a lot of times these items become really big in the minds of directors. But really, what I want you to focus on today as you're listening are the common sense approaches to these three areas. And we're going to touch just briefly on each of those areas as we move through this.
As I see those titles, the question that occurs to me is, they make sense to me, but what standard am I being measured or held to as we apply those three concepts?
Well, first of all, the duty of care is the one you hear the most about, and the duty of care refers to the level of competence expected. That includes your need for orientation and training. So the director may or may not have all of the burden involved here. The board itself should. I would suggest if you're being asked to serve on a board of directors of an organization or you're new to an executive committee, the first thing you ought to ask is, what kind of orientation am I going to get to know what the functions are and how I'm going to serve on this committee or this board? If they don't have any orientation, it may be time to suggest that they put something in place so that you can get up to speed. The standard of care that is required under the duty of care is pretty easy. It's that of an ordinary prudent person. Now, I recognize that none of us here today would consider ourselves anything but prudent. And so it really is a reasonableness standard. Now, I would say if you're serving on the board of a hospital, let's say a surgery hospital or something, you may have a little higher standard medically, but you don't have really any different standard even in those types of organizations if you're on a business board. Your question would be is, what would an ordinary reasonable person do if they were in my position? So that's something to keep in mind, that it's not going to be that onerous. And really it gets back to some of the common sense things. The duty of care, a reasonable person attends the meetings regularly. They exercise independent judgment. Let's say that you're a lay person on the committee, or you're a person who's coming into an institution from another organization of the church. Maybe you're the treasurer of a union or a conference or whatever, and you're asked to serve on an institution board. You need to come in there with independent judgment. You need to look at things carefully, and you need to make the decision based on your assessment of those things, not simply be there to rubber stamp what other people are doing. You need to be adequately informed for making decisions. And frankly, I've sat on a board or two where they've asked me to vote on something and I feel like I haven't been given enough information. At that point in time, I put my hand up and say, look, I'm not willing to vote this because I need more information. Now, you'll never have 100% of the information, but you need enough information that you are really informed.
Perhaps it goes back to that reasonable concept.
Reasonable concept. If you're being asked to vote $1 million item and you hardly even know what the item is, a reasonable person wouldn't vote to spend that money.
No.
So you need to also have the duty of being actively involved in the oversight of the organization, and again, the duty of risk management. Especially if you're asked to serve on an audit committee of an organization. That committee reports back to the board, and it's very important in those scenarios that you ask the questions that a reasonable person would do, like how do you divide up so that the same person isn't receiving the money, depositing the money, and so forth. Pretty basic common sense.
The duty of loyalty. Standard of faithfulness to the organization. What does this mean?
Well, that's kind of a nice sounding statement. It almost sounds a little bit religious, and I suppose in some respects it is from the standpoint that we are working in a church organizational setting. But the duty of loyalty asks for your undivided allegiance when making decisions. Now that again sounds pretty onerous, and it really isn't, because what it requires you to do is simply put the organization, whether that's the conference, the school, the business, whatever board you're sitting on, ahead of your own interests and look only at the interests of the institution. The duty of loyalty can be breached when members of the board use organizational property or resources for personal use. That again sounds pretty obvious, but sometimes it's not quite as obvious as that. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in the church when it comes to the duty of loyalty is a lot of times you are sitting, for example, you may be an employee of a conference or a union or a division, and you're asked to sit on an educational board or an institutional board. Which hat do you wear when you're sitting on that board? And really the answer is, under the legal concepts, you're sitting on that board, you need to have that duty of loyalty to do the right thing for that institution. I don't think, however, that voids doing the right thing for the church, because hopefully we have this synergy of activity that we're all part of the church organization. You also need to safeguard corporate opportunity, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the conflict of interest, because conflict of interest is where the duty of loyalty falls in. And you also need to maintain the confidentiality of privileged information. This to me is really a tough one because in the church you have the situation where you are serving in multiple capacities, and confidentiality is often overridden by those other relationships, and also just the unfortunate, I'd like to tell you what I learned on that board before anybody else does. So that's kind of a challenge that we have, and that fits under the conflict of interest that we're going to move into next quite quickly.
All right, the church has a policy. Let me just quickly read it to you. General Conference Working Policy E8505 is defined. Conflict of interest shall mean any circumstance under which an employee or volunteer, by virtue of financial or other personal interest, present or potential, directly or indirectly, may be influenced or appear to be influenced by any motive or desire for personal advantage, tangible or intangible, other than the success and well-being of the denomination. Well, honestly, that sounds reasonable, but let's talk about...
Sounds like a lot of words to me.
Well, it does sound like a lot of words.
You know, I'm a pretty common sense person, and I know a very scientific, or I should say a very complex legal term that would apply here, and that is, if you'll pardon me, does it meet the smell test? And the smell test is, you know, you can usually tell when something just doesn't smell right. And a lot of times conflict of interest is, again, a very practical approach where the institution is not getting the primary focus. And a lot of the conflicts of interest around that, and I'll get into some of those illustrations here momentarily. But when you come to a conflict of interest, the rules are pretty straightforward. They're not nearly as complex as one might think. There's basically 3 rules. If you sense that you have a conflict of interest, and again, my suggestion is if you're serving on a board or a committee, you're best to err on the side of being a little conservative there. One is to declare, second is to decide, and the third is to document. Those are how you address the conflict of interest. And basically, you come into this, there's kind of 3 types of conflicts of interest that you need to get into. The first is those that simply require disclosure. They're inconsequential. Those that require prior approval before you move ahead. And then there's those that are absolutely prohibited. They're illegal or they're unethical. But remember, even in these 3 scenarios, declare, decide, you don't get to make that decision. The board makes that decision. And then you document that you had actually taken that declaration. And that's often done in the church through the conflict of interest policy, which basically you fill out a form once a year that says you don't have a conflict of interest. And then during the ensuing year, if you do have a conflict that comes up, you should declare that to the board chairman or to the committee that's been responsible for it. But keep in mind, when you sign that conflict of interest, give it some thought, because you need to declare anything that really looks like or is a conflict of interest. One thing I should add here is that the church conflict of interest policy clearly states that merely sitting on 2 boards does not create a conflict of interest. You may have transactions that involve those 2 boards that you should declare as being potential conflict of interest so that the board understands that. So let's take a look at the conflicts of interest that require disclosure. And there's grades of these. I always hate to give you lists because some of these could, depending on the circumstances, get pushed up to the approval level. But serving on 2 corporate bodies at the same time which are involved in the same transaction. Let's say, for example, that you're sitting on the conference executive committee, and then you're also sitting on an institution committee. Maybe it's a union institution or some other organization, a college or something like that. And there's an action that comes up, a transaction that comes up that involves your conference and that institution, and it could potentially put you in a conflict. At that point, your duty is simply to declare that to the board. I suppose if the board says, well, you should not be involved in that, then you'd simply step out of that transaction discussion. The other is involvement with a company that does business with the organization of the church. Now, keep in mind, lay people have a lot of these issues that come up from time to time. Let's say, for example, that you're an employee of a bank and you are a member of the Adventist church and you become a lay member of a board or a committee. In that scenario, you discover when you come into that first meeting that the bank for that institution is the bank you work for. That would be best then to declare, hey, I worked for Bank of America or whatever bank it is. But obviously, if you're a clerk in that bank versus the president of the bank, that certainly would not require any more than the disclosure. Making referrals or directing purchasing opportunities to business in which you or a family have an interest. Again, pretty obvious. If you're the local vendor for office supplies and you suggest that the school you're on the board for or the church is on the board, church conference committee is needing to buy office supplies, if you were to refer that organization to your store, you better declare that, and frankly, I think that one would actually require an approval as well.
I see the word family there. Are we talking about nepotism issues when we talk about boards and families?
Well, you are to some extent, but you're probably the last point there, favoritism in employment, is really the one where you get a situation. I know we hired an employee here recently, and I was later talking to an officer in another church organization, and he said, "I should tell you that so-and-so is my cousin, and that person works for you." I said, "Well, that's nice to know." We didn't hire her because, matter of fact, we didn't even know she was the cousin of this particular officer. And we said, no problem. She's a good employee. We hired her because we needed her skills. If you're involved in the hiring process and you're hiring your kids or you're hiring your spouse or you're hiring your nieces and nephews and everybody else in the family, then you need to declare to the board that you've got a conflict of interest in that hiring process so that they can approve it or otherwise. Most organizations have some kind of policy in place now about hiring family, to what degree of closeness they can or cannot be, and who can be involved in the process of hiring, and those types of things. ARM has a policy like that in place where we don't have employees from the same household working in the same departments and those types of things, and we try to build some buffers in between departments and that where this could happen.
All right, so looking at conflict of interest requiring prior approval, let's say that I'm very interested in pushing a third-party vendor because I have an interest in that third party. I think they're just the right solution.
Well, most of these, you can see now on the screen, requiring prior approval. Any kind of significant financial interest, lending or borrowing of funds, those types of things involving a third party where you as a director have an interest in, really require the declaration, the prior approval, and then have it documented. In most of these cases, the board will recuse the person from the conflict. If you are asked to step out of the organizational activity with regard to that transaction, you have a duty to stop your discussions in those activities, including outside of the board, any type of effort to influence the transaction. And that's where I find a lot of challenges at times, is that the people will say, I've got a conflict of interest, I'm not going to vote, but they continue to try to influence the transaction. It's very important for your ethics to cease all of your activities. The other thing is you can't use confidential information obtained from your position on the board. And that's where a lot of people sometimes will go astray. I was sitting in a meeting one time in a church organization, and an opportunity came up, and I heard a member of the committee say, wow, that's really a great opportunity that my company can take advantage of. And I thought, somebody needs to review the conflict of interest policies. So the next area that are prohibitive completely from ever being done, and again, if you get into these circumstances, you need to declare them, and you need to stop getting involved in this type of activity. Those are performing duties inadequately due to involvement in external activities. If you're so distracted from your activities on the board, you need to resign if you can't do them. Accepting gifts, fees, and personal benefits for performing duties of your office such as your directorship, or from a person or entity that does business with your organization. Most organizations today have a policy of some kind as to the level of gifting that's permitted. I've seen policies such as if you can eat it in one day, or if you can enjoy it in one day or whatever, then that's probably okay. So if somebody takes you out to dinner, or if they give you a box of candy for Christmas, I don't recommend you eat it all in one day, but those are kind of insignificant gifts that probably are not going to create a problem. But if you start getting significant gifts to influence your decision making, those are absolutely prohibited. Also, associating your name or work with external activity in a way that implies endorsement. The most strange one I've heard of on this is I actually know of a fellow who had business cards printed with the name of the institution on it, that he was a member of the board of directors, and he would give these business cards out, and to me it was totally out of line, because outside of the board activity, an individual director has no authority, and by implying that he had authority for the institution was an inappropriate use of that institution. Directing resources to oneself is another one, and a lot of times it comes into play in the next bullet, which is owning or leasing property with knowledge that the church has an active or potential interest in it. You hear about these kind of situations where an individual sits on the board, hears that an institution wants to buy the neighboring property, and goes out and purchases it himself, and then tries to sell it to the institution. Totally prohibited under the conflicts of interest for any type of corporate entity, much less a church entity. And then making or use of disseminated information acquired through employment for personal profit. Again, that would be in the role of a director. Continuing that list, the list for what's prohibited seems a little longer, but you cannot derive any personal profit by reason of position. It's immaterial whether the organization was damaged. The duty of good faith is to disclose, and the transaction would have to be authorized. So if you don't do that, it's absolutely prohibited. And then diverting an opportunity away from an organization to oneself. Let's say, for example, you hear of a really good opportunity for an educational institution to add something, some aspect of training or something, and you say, wow, my organization could do that just as effectively, and you don't get that, pass that on to the institution, you take it for your own. Again, totally prohibited. I think that kind of covers that list. We've got a couple of duplicates there. So again, I just want to emphasize what to do when conflicts arise. If approved, you can continue the activity. If they're not approved, or even if they're approved and you're asked to withdraw from the organizational decision making, there's no voting, no participation, no discussion, no presence, and no influence. You need to then move to the last duty, and we will wrap this up, the duty of obedience, which is making sure that the organization remains obedient to its purpose and role. In the Adventist Church, that includes the duty of making sure it meets its Adventist mission, its beliefs and culture, the duty to comply with the laws, the charter or the bylaws of the company, and fulfilling the commitments, including previous ones.